Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Everlast podcast, number 5. I can't believe we're already on number 5. This is crazy. That means 5 months of Everlast that we've been doing.
Holy smokes,
Can't
that's
even believe
crazy.
it. Yeah, it's insane, absolutely insane. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different than our normal podcast. Before we get into it, actually, let's talk a little bit about the disclaimers. So, Kyle, if you want to talk about that really quick.
Absolutely. So everything that you see in the creation of Everlast, whether it's intellectual property, music, images, all that kind of fun stuff, are copywritten by Fantasy Forge Studios and myself, Kyle LaFont, the creator of Everlast. So don't take it and use it for commercial purposes and whatnot. This game, again, is still currently in the final stages of development and whatnot, but we're bringing it to you early to be able to kind of build some of the hype for it, but also to share something that's so beloved to us with you. That being said, if you do wish to want to use this for any kind of personal means, whether it's your own D&D campaigns, your own attempt at an Everlast campaign and whatnot, feel free to use it. Just again, everything that is present in there is owned by Fantasy Forge Studios and Kyle LaFont.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Kyle, getting that legal jargon out of the way. But typically what this podcast covers is the 2 previous sessions for the month. And so we actually did do sessions 8 and 9, and this podcast would normally be covering that. However, we're going to postpone that for a later podcast, an extra podcast. So we're going to be having some extra stuff, which is kind of nice. Instead, we want to talk a little bit more about the game of Everlast itself, in particular, what it takes to create a game and the growing pains of creating a game. It's something we've all been going through behind the scenes. It's something we've been talking a lot with the guys about, and I think it's something that we really want to be able to share with you guys and be as transparent right up front with you guys as much as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's so easy behind the lens of a camera to really think like, oh my gosh, like this looks so easy as far as like creating and so fun. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, it is really fun, but by no means is it easy. Creating something that is so dear to myself, so dear to my heart, and sharing it with the group of Eclos and all of our playtesters in this game. It's one of those things that it's taken a lot of work. Like literally up to this point, it's been about 6, almost 7 years in the making. And obviously during that time, and we'll get into this a little bit later, Everlast has gone through so many stages.
As everything does when you're trying to create something new. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so it's one of those things where we want to be able to, as part of this specific podcast, share with you guys some of that process of creating something like a tabletop RPG, especially in today's climate, and what to kind of expect going through it, especially going through it with minimal of resources as we've had, especially in the previous years. It's something that is not easy, and it's something that takes a lot of time, but it's something that is so fun. And so being able to share, that whole process with you and kind of just talk about that, dissect it a little bit, and figure out, what's going on in my day-to-day life. My 8-hour-a-day job is at this point creating Everlast. So it's a beautiful thing that I am very excited to share with each and every one of you.
Yeah, today in particular, we're going to be covering 3 main topics when it comes to the creation of a game. Not just Everlast, but just any new game. We're just using Everlast as an example. So the 3 topics we're going to be covering is, first, we're going to be talking about the creation of the game. So everything that goes into, as a creator, what goes into the game. We're also going to be talking about testing a game. So obviously, I'm not the one necessarily creating the game, but I'm definitely very integral in helping him test the game. And all the other guys are really integral in helping him test the game. And then, of course, the last thing we're going to be talking about is playing the game. We're making a game to be played. So we got 3 main topics: creating, testing, and playing, that we're going to be talking about today. So, Kyle, without further ado, let's get into the creation of Everlast, or just the creation of making a new game in general. So I would say the first and most important part of creating a game is originality. I definitely think that's incredibly important. In particular, tabletop RPGs. I know recently tabletop RPGs have become massive in recent years. I know D&D's been around since the 1970s, and other tabletop RPGs have popped up here and there throughout that time. However, within the past decade, think decade, maybe a little bit longer than a decade, it's really made its way into the forefront of popular culture these days. So Dungeons and Dragons 5e, for example, is really big. Pathfinder's really big. There's other ones, for example, like Gloomhaven as well, which is technically a tabletop RPG that we're battling with, and we're trying to find our originality there. So do you have anything to comment on that, Kyle?
Well, the originality where it comes from is being able to create something, and again, with the ultimate goal in mind of something that's fun and something that's optimized to play.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that Everlast runs up against, especially coming from 5e D&D, is, in my experience playing 5e D&D, it's a very optimized system that, I mean, it's not perfect in any means, but like it is a really optimized system to be able to play something that's really fun with a lot of creative license and whatnot, to be able to really make it your own. And I think that's where the popularity has come in, whether it's from Critical Role or other big Twitch streams, other YouTube channels, and that kind of stuff that covers D&D, whether it's the homebrew stuff that you can make or just the rule sets in general. It's something that Everlast, it's kind of first and foremost in my mind is going to have to compete with. It's kind of this big behemoth, especially now that with it being owned by Wizards of the Coast and everything, it's kind of difficult. And so being able to create something original without getting lawsuits or like anything like that. I mean, obviously creating something that fits in the tabletop RPG genre, but without like lawsuits of pretty much like copying a game. And what's the point of that? You might as well, instead of playing Everlast, like Everlast was a copy of that. Instead of playing that, you might as well just play D&D 5e with, Everlast homebrew.
Exactly.
So what makes, Everlast something different? And honestly, where Everlast comes from is, when originally I was thinking about the idea of this, it was more of a narrative aspect than anything. And so there was this world that I was creating, kind of like how you create a world as an author. There was this world that I was creating with Everlast that was heavily inspired by Tolkien, heavily inspired by the role-playing games that I played. I loved Japanese RPGs growing up, so all of that kind of stuff, and it's kind of incorporating all of that into a world that ultimately is essentially Christian, a Christian good worldview, where again you have that classic good versus evil. But one of the things that I was finding as I was like creating this is like, how amazing would it be to be able to create something that you could actually like play? And actually that was the very first experience of D&D that I had with my little brother Cole. And I was just like, oh my gosh, how fun would that be if I created Everlast, this world that I was creating, and made it a D&D 5e homebrew campaign. And actually, I know for those who've listened to this podcast before, one of the things that we did was for my bachelor's party years back. My bachelor's party was the very first session 1. We already had session 0, but session 1 of Everlast in a D&D setting. And all the guys that you see on the channel now were there and were present, with the exception of Max, who did end up coming in later. And it began to be something where this original story really began to unfold through this storytelling method of D&D. And it was at that point where I was like, this is really fun. And you know what? Like, not only do I love this so much, but this could actually be a way for me to get my original creative idea of Everlast and make it into something that, is really great, and with adding different elements of things like, again, like JRPGs, where you have like the different roles and whatnot, but also borrowing from things like wargaming and that kind of stuff that I was always interested in, with like Middle Earth strategy battle game growing up, and all that kind of fun stuff, where it's like you kind of take like elements from all these things and make it into one game. But obviously it's like, how do you do that?
Exactly.
And so when you're creating this game, there's a lot of those growing pains of being like, man, D&D 5e is already so optimized. Like, how am I going to be able to create something that competes with that?
Well, one thing I know that I really love about Everlast, and this is where originality really does come in as far as when it comes to Everlast goes. I know it's not as stigmatized these days, but I know back in the early days in D&D and stuff, especially for households that pertained to a Christian way of life, it was like super taboo, and a lot of people didn't want to play. And actually, I think that's partly what kept it from being such a popular game. I think people, when they thought of the fantasy genre in particular, it was in like the use of magic and the use of that kind of stuff. It was like witchcraft, and it was something that wasn't like good. Whereas
Yeah, like all the old source books had things like demonic iconography and like that kind of stuff in it. So like the church looked at it as like something that was like really evil and taboo and things not to be able to look at. Where
Exactly.
you have like these like Christian worlds. Like I think of like Harry Potter. I think of Lord of the Rings, especially, where like these are actually praised among so many church scholars of things that are like quintessentially Christian, quintessentially point towards God, even with the existence of magic. And so as D&D began to develop, it maybe shed some of those like physical elements of like losing some of the demonic iconography, that kind of stuff. But it essentially, you still have like things like classes like the Warlock, where it's like you literally make a pact with a demon, and like you have like those kinds of elements that still keep people from playing. I know, and actually my early D&D playing games, Cole, who again is Luxalia on this channel, you'll very much recognize that. Like he refuses to play a warlock character because it's just like, I will not have anything to do with demons and that kind of stuff. Some people take it to that degree. But the thing about Everlast is I want it to be able to exist in a space where it's just like you're not limited from in the Christian worldview. You're not limited by the choices that you can make because there are no like classes or roles where you are worshiping demons. I mean, sure, maybe like in the backstory you might come from like a really like sketchy past. Maybe you worked for Creatures of the Void or whatever the case, but it's supposed to be a redeeming story. There is one of the biggest, I think, differences between just Everlast itself and like D&D is as far as alignment goes. Every single character that is created are supposed to be essentially good creatures that are maybe have the influence of evil every now and then, and they deal with their own like suffering and miseries and that kind of stuff as they encounter different things such as fates checks and whatnot. But they're essentially good people, good creatures that are trying to save this world of Everlast, and bring it to something that is ultimately good, like bring it back towards Alamnia, which is the god of this world.
Exactly. And again, I personally think that's one of the original aspects of this game, which makes it like so appealing to everyone, right? I don't think anyone would disagree, or they would fault Everlast for being a game that doesn't have that kind of stuff. I think everyone can enjoy it. So that like that's one thing that I think D&D doesn't have over Everlast, is everyone can enjoy this game and everyone can get something good out of it. So,
well, the thing about D&D is like I think one of the things that actually people really love about D&D is the fact that it is so open that it does allow you to play the evil character. But at the same time, it was difficult for me to justify like trying to defeat the biggest bad, trying to defeat evil when you are evil itself. I don't understand how like someone would benefit from that. And so like just from a logical perspective, I mean, maybe taking over that evil position and trying to gain some kind of power, but it's ultimately like this game, like the power belongs to Alamnia, belongs to the creator of this world, which is ultimately good, which is ultimately just. And so it should be every message that should be driven in this game in Everlast is striving towards that. And where some of the players like have shortcomings as far as living up to that, their characters are very physically affected by that in the form of misery and changing their alignment from like neutral to virtuous to a viceful creature.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing that's incredibly important in creating that kind of thing too is the creation of other characters, not just player characters, but the creation of the impactful characters within the games themselves. I know NPCs are often looked at as these characters that are just kind of throwaway, and I think a lot of people, even in our party, I think oftentimes we kind of think of some of the NPCs we run into as just kind of like, throw them off to
extra
the side.
Bodies to throw at something.
Exactly, extra bodies to throw at something, where in reality, I mean, these are creatures of Alumnia, and these are creatures that are also, yes, may have their struggles, but are inherently good for the most part. You know what I mean? And so,
but here's the beautiful thing about that, though, Dane. Like, I people can approach these NPCs with all kinds of different mindsets, and I know Yuki very specifically does look at these other creatures, and she feels pity for them. Like, she actually has like a kinship with them. I think specifically about like Salic and that kind of stuff. Like,
I'm not gonna lie. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm not gonna lie.
Okay.
During this past session in particular, a little bit of my Yuki was coming out when I was playing Thordane, especially because we had Matic and we had Salic down in the sewers, and they're NPCs, like they're just bandits. They have like no HP. We went into this crazy encounter, and a little bit of my Yuki came out. Like, honestly, if Jonathan was playing Thordane how Thordane was intended to be, Thordane probably wouldn't have cared about how like they would have ended up, but I was doing my best to form myself as a body wall so that they didn't even actually have to interact with the monsters at all. And I don't know. So like, yes, I think Yuki as a character just gets very, very attached to NPCs. But again, she tries to see the best in everyone, and she tries to
but here's the thing, though. Like, I think it's a very justifiable thing for people to look maybe at, and I'm not even just talking about like NPCs, but other people. It's like self-preservation in a way. And so it's like, how do you deal with that? And that's what this game is supposed to do. Like, it goes beyond just the typical, I'm playing this for fun. It's like, by actually making these decisions in game, it dictates how you as a person think about life itself. So it's just like, I have this overwhelming obstacle. Why aren't you just throwing bodies into this giant behemoth slime that is coming to where it's like, okay, maybe they have low HP and one attack from this thing could be the end for them. And
it was for one of them. Honestly,
yes, absolutely.
It was for one of them, the one that led us down into the sewers. He took one hit from the slime, and he ended up passing away, unfortunately.
Completely dissolved.
Yep.
Yes. No traces left.
Nope.
Just
dissolved by a slime.
Very dissolved bandit. So you have like those types of things, and so when it, again, going back to the creativity of this game and forming very key characters as well. Like, how do you make them real enough to where it really actually forces players to be able to like have to make that decision, as opposed to like, oh, our backs are against a wall. What do we do? Do we fight till our last, or do we just throw the NPC at them? It's completely up to the characters and how they want to play it. But I think a lot of it has to do again with the writing of these characters. Like, do these NPCs serve a purpose outside of, oh, they're just bodies that we throw at them? Or it's like, as written in the text, like, how do you make it to where Fate Weavers can actually know enough about these characters to play them in a realistic way? And so that's another element, as far as even just narrative, that really helps to propel the story of Everlast. Like, I mean, obviously you have like the big NPCs. I think, for example, like in this current campaign that they're doing, Gunter's a really big one. He is this war hero that sails the seas on the Flortensia, his big ship, like this swashbuckler, like war hero that's known for taking down all kinds of bandits and pirates and all that kind of stuff, and protects the seas, looking for creatures to make Everlast a little bit safer, to slay, essentially. And he is this guy with a lot of prowess, and so I think it's easy for adventurers to be able to look up to him and be like, yeah, I want to be by him. Like, I want to like keep him by like my side, and I don't want him to die because things could get really bad. Where it's like, you have this lowly character like Salic, and I think it's easy to overlook their value because they're not quite as strong statistically. They're not quite as strong as Gunter would be.
And they have their issues. I will say he's gotten us, at least the party, into some very close calls because of, again, his mental stability in the situations too was close to breaking and whatnot. So if anything, he's had his bonuses, but he's also had a lot of his negatives for being with us in the party. Like, we could just go and just completely just destroy this fortress if we really wanted to, but we're having to keep characters alive. At least I'm wanting to keep characters alive. But you could also play it as in like, yeah, they showed you to the bandit fortress, or they showed you to the sorcerer's fortress, and then you just kill them, kind of thing. Like, you can do that, and that's one way to play it. It might not be good for you, but that's one way to play it. So.
Yeah, and there's benefits maybe to that, but there's also negatives to that too. And so again, going back to the creation of this, it's like it's much more than just like writing a story. It's creating people inside of a story and being able to allow, very realistic role-playing opportunities, tactics, being able to know how to use people in order to keep them alive and all that kind of stuff. And honestly, just like the general gameplay. And I think that's, when it comes to creating, the narrative is great and all that kind of stuff. And again, Everlast started off as a vision of what, of a world that I wanted to be able to bring out, not necessarily just in my mind, but bring it out to the public. And so obviously that next step in creating is the gameplay.
Exactly.
Next.
Yep.
And so, again, drawing from various elements of other games, other types of game genres, we have obviously the current version of what we do now of Everlast. And as you saw in our last couple of videos, kind of how some of those battle mechanics are, like where maybe it does tie into maybe some elements of D&D, but it definitely ties into a lot of RPG elements and gaming elements and that kind of stuff. Where maybe the combat might not be quite as streamlined or as quick as like a D&D campaign. It provides like separate spaces for, I kind of think of like Final Fantasy or like Golden Sun or like any of those kind of like OG, maybe not to say OG, but like any of those Japanese role-playing games where it's like, okay, during this turn, you can do these certain things, and these are where these certain rules come into play.
Exactly.
Where it's, I know for some of our players at the game, where a lot of maybe some of this controversy, as far as, not necessarily controversy, but where some of the problems and struggles have come in is everyone was so used to playing Everlast as a D&D campaign, where this is different. This is very different. And, as the creator of this game, I've seen where like some of maybe the players have struggled and of trying to get used to this kind of mechanic.
Yeah, I think we all have to a certain extent. And, it's one of those things that, especially, I'll talk about a little bit about it in the testing section, which is coming up soon here. But I really do think that it's just, again, like, it's a different game. It's a different game. We can't expect it to be that way. And I know that's really helped me get over it. I know some of the other members are a little slower to it, the accepting of it. But yeah, I definitely agree with that.
But as playtesters too, it's one of those things where, as a creator, this is one thing that is super duper important. Being open to the criticism. And not even just criticism and as looking at it as criticism, but looking at it as, okay, yeah, maybe something doesn't feel right. Okay, now going back to the drawing board, how can I make this improve? So you'll notice, and like even in future streams and whatnot, you might notice that some of the mechanics that were mentioned in previous episodes of the podcast or things are maybe different from previous streams have changed a little bit or maybe changed a lot. And a big reason for that is because, we've sat down as a team and it's just like, okay, these elements are clunky. These elements, maybe are good. How can we build on them? Exactly. And so as a creator, you have to be able to understand that change is okay. Like you might have this idea and you can't sit here and get offended by those changes that are being made. And again, we'll talk about that in the testing section, but I think that's really important. And more often than not, as far as the creation of this game, one of the biggest struggles has been missing players as well.
Yes.
And that's been something that's been kind of tough. Just the consistency of people. And I know you guys have noticed in some of, especially the past couple of months, we've been missing a lot of people. We've been having a lot of 2-player parties and all that kind of stuff. But as a Fate Weaver, as a Dungeon Master, whatever system you're playing, I think with each group, and it's something that in the game itself, you can't really build into it too much. Yeah. It's more up to the Fate Weaver. It's more up to the Dungeon Master to be able to deal with and sit down with their group and lay out expectation.
But also making sure that everyone's in the loop with what's going on. So players that do miss, like making sure that they're up to date when they get back. And
yeah, like for example, if there is like some kind of small tweak in the mechanics, like you let them know, like, okay, this is what's happening. And then also just keep like holding them to the mat about just getting to know their characters, and if there are changes, making sure you tell them ahead of time. And then also just being available to be able to sit down with their characters and just go over things, like talk about questions. Actually, one of the things that we do as a party is we actually meet about 45 minutes ish before our streams. We sit down and we go over who has questions. Like, and a lot of the times, like, people don't, and then we just sit and catch up and talk and we have fun before the stream starts. However, there are so many times where especially people who've been missing are just like, okay, what do I miss? Like, I have a question about this. Like, I noticed, and they actually do an amazing job.
They do.
About going back and listening to like some of the streams. They're like,
it's available on YouTube, just like this podcast.
It is available on YouTube. Yeah, absolutely. But they'll go back and be like, this is different. Like, can you explain this to me? So that's our time to be able to do that. Before we actually start streaming and everything. So again, the stream doesn't get bogged down with, too much of the stuff that's going on.
Yeah, but also just, I think, having to be understanding too. Like, I know, like, again, since this is being streamed in particular, like Everlast is being streamed, the show must go on. So regardless of whether or not everyone can be there, the show must go on. So how do you deal with that? Like, coming from a creating perspective of the game, I know you've created the narrative ahead of time, but when you hear that, like, maybe a player isn't going to be able to make it ahead of time, like, how has that affected your creation of scenarios and gameplay, I guess?
So creating lots of options. So not making it too sandboxy where like players become lost, but being able to, like, for example, as we saw in the last couple of episodes, parties having to be split. And so obviously Luxalia, and again, if you haven't watched the last episode, go watch that. Last 2 episodes, go watch that, so you're not, so spoilers aren't a thing. But in the latest couple of episodes, Yuki and Zil actually ended up going off with Krothos, who's one of the prisoners that they found in this jungle keep. And they were actually summoned pretending to be priestesses or cultists, per se, to one of actually the mini-boss. So I actually split them off to go up to one of the mini-bosses, where I split Luxalia, Thordane, and Belbin, which, again, Luxalia and Belbin, Connor were not there for the session beforehand. And so in the latest session, that was pretty much an experience of where they got to have their time in the spotlight, where the previous episode was more of like Zil and Yuki. And so being able to understand that and what's going on, and being able to have the options when you're creating a game, when you're writing a narrative, that, you don't necessarily build it knowing that players are going to be there. If anything, as a creator, you create something with the assumption that everyone's going to be there.
Yeah.
But you have like a little bit of some fudge room where it gives the dungeon master, the Fate Weaver, the freedom to be able to split the party if they can. So either that players, like the 2 players that are there, aren't controlling 3 other characters.
Exactly.
Or like the Fate Weaver doesn't have to control.
Which, to be quite honest, I would so much rather be kind of how it was last time. Like, I mean, Thordane, Jonathan hasn't been here for the last couple months, so I've been controlling Thordane as a main character. And so obviously during that last battle, during the last session 9, I was able to control Thordane doing it. But Max was there sitting there, and he was enjoying watching it too. But like the fact that Max is incredibly understanding about the fact that you're just doing your best. You're trying to catch everyone up with the narrative. And he could enjoy a really action-packed filled session from the previous session, And it's not like you completely neglected us. We still did some of like our part in our role playing and exploring a little bit while they were doing the battles and stuff like that. And I would have been in the same position as Max would have been, just like sitting there kind of watching as an observer, if it wasn't for the fact that John's not there,
And here's the thing, I could have played that better. I could have actually had Max play Salic and Matic, giving him the stats and everything.
But knowing how he did when you gave him control toward the end of that session, he would have killed them. He would have killed them.
Potentially, yes. But it's one of those things that, one thing that I really do appreciate about Max, and honestly the vast majority of the players, is like it's the communication, being able to let them know that it's like, okay, well, you know, there's sacrifices that you have to make. And yes, maybe it does seem unfair, like if you're there for every session and you might have to sit out one of the sessions because we're catching other players up. Like it might seem unfair, but everybody's understanding for the most part about that. And you know what, it just what you have to do and kind of the sacrifices that you make for your party. It's like, even though you're not directly involved in the combat, it doesn't mean that you're not there. Exactly. I mean, heck, I think Max was even like in the chat and everything.
Yeah, he was very active, even though.
Yeah, super active in the chat. He was understanding about just the circumstances in general. And the nice thing going forward is the party hopefully does get joined up again, and everybody can be a part of it again. Like as a Fate Weaver, being able to bring everybody back together.
Exactly, and I know like this is the thing too. It's like trying to make those critiques, trying to test things out and how they are. So I guess this is gonna move us on to the next session. Let's talk a little bit about like just testing of a brand new game, and this is kind of the process that we've been going through as far as the testing. So the very first thing when it comes to testing is critiques, positive and
learning how to effectively critique.
That's exactly. So as a Fate Weaver, as someone who's creating the game, how do you effectively critique a game based off of whatever?
I think first and foremost, again, it kind of goes back to the question as far as creation. Is what we just played fun? I think that's the biggest thing. And actually, it's really been interesting is the vast majority of the sessions that like have been really fun. Not only because I really enjoy the group of guys that we're with, but like the story just is so fun to be able to go through.
I'm on the edge of my seat every single session.
There's suspense, there's, you know, and like even with like the combat, like I'm really enjoying how the combat's starting to like really become its own thing. And as the party's been getting used to it, being able to do that. As far as critiquing myself, I think that's the first thing that I have to do is realize is like, am I having fun and are my players having fun? That's a really big thing. And number two, being open to giving it a chance. So like one of the things, like for example, the difference between like the combat mechanics of Everlast and let's say the combat mechanics of D&D, as I mentioned before, D&D feels very optimized and streamlined and it's really quick, where Everlast maybe has a slower combat system. But the combat system itself, it's broken down into certain parts. Yes, maybe there's a couple more rolls that have to be made for everybody than like a D&D, like where, for example, in D&D, your initiative is just your initiative for the entire combat. So you roll once and then you do one. I wanted to be able to make the dexterity stat a little bit more useful to players. But two, in order for this game, like my game has a lot more focus on positioning and movement, where I feel like D&D, it's just like you throw bodies into things. And then if you have good terrain pieces, utilizing them sometimes. Where my game, it's like positioning is everything. Being able, for example, in the last sewer battle, Dane and Belbin using their bodies to clog up areas to be able to protect Matic and Salic so they can actually pull the lever to make sure all the water goes away. Or even so much using of like, how is your starting position, you know, forcing you to be able to know how to move and avoid being trapped, avoid things like falling prone or like things like that. Like there's a lot more to think about as far as moving, which is why there's an entire section in the combat round dedicated to movement, support actions, and like some type of ranged attacks. And then I felt like with all that in mind, if like we kept everything together, it just gets way too congested, and then a lot of mechanics start to kind of just like fall off the face of the earth, and it doesn't really matter.
Well,
and
sorry, continue. I'll talk about it after you're done with your thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And then going on to the attack phase and all that kind of stuff, you know, everything that's happened in basically the movement phase is resolved in the attack phase. So people who have initiated combats and that kind of stuff, it's super easy. Literally just go through, do your attacks, think about that, and then that's the end of that. Then everyone disengages from things, and then everything starts over again.
Well, I was just gonna say maybe maybe it's hard for me to like be credible source about this because again I do have a lot invested into this game and I just have a lot of fun every single time I play it. But one thing I actually really have noticed is, for example, when we were playing Everlast back when it was D&D 5e style playing, I oftentimes felt like battles kind of took a while, but I also felt it was incredibly repetitive. I know like Yuki as being a DPS, like her character being a DPS, it was just like she just rushed things and decapitated them and rushed things and did this kind of stuff. Whereas now, like I really have to think about what actions I can do. It actually it frees up options for me to be able to use ranged weapons if I want to. It frees up options for me to position myself better so I can save characters. I think the positioning phase is probably the best addition to the battle phase that you added. Again, how
Yeah, or like if you fight something low level and you just engage one thing in combat, you make the combat challenging as one thing, and you kill it, you don't have anything like throwing weapons or whatnot. You can't do anything, like you're stuck there. So it's like, how do you best position yourself to be able to become most effective? For example, for someone like Luxalia, who only has one attack to begin with, it might benefit her more to maybe just engage one thing in combat and rely on Belbin and Zill, Thordane, or not even Thordane, but Belbin, Zill, and Yuki, Belbin, Zill, and Yuki to be able to drag a lot more of the combats off to free Luxalia and Thordane off for either ranged attacks or some kind of support healing. Where, like, for example, Belbin, like in this first turn of battle, he can have up to 3 attack actions. So he utilizes that by getting himself trapped and surrounded, but at the same time, he's able to kill 3 of the creatures. Or, for example, with Yuki, she's got her dual wielding, and so she could have a potential of 4 attacks. So it benefits her to challenge multiple creatures in combat, as opposed to just like one, because once you defeat a creature, you can't just move on to your next one. Like, your turn ends. And so you have to be able to know how to engage in combat to be able to optimize as best as possible.
I agree. And again, I think maybe right now it feels kind of like chunky. Chunky is not the right word to put it, but it feels
clunky.
like, not even clunky in a sense. It's just like, okay, we're doing this part. Okay, we're moving on to this part. We're moving on to this part. But I feel like that's just the process of learning a new game. Kind of like you mentioned.
The growing pains.
Exactly, the growing pains. Kind of like you mentioned a little bit before, the fact that it's gonna feel slower, and like you have to give it a chance. Like that's the big thing.
You have to know all of the different things that you can do too. I know after the latest session, the guys and us, I actually sat down, since we had 4 out of the 5 guys there, to kind of just like go over like how everything felt. One of the things, like, we actually had like a decent discussion about we had a discussion about maybe some of the things that felt right and some things that didn't, and also being able to like give it a chance. Like, all right, this is great, being able to address things, and even going back from like the idea of effectively critiquing a game is like, okay, you have to, like, as a play tester, you have to be able to not just identify what doesn't feel right, but being able to actively think about, like, how can I actively say this to, improve the game. It's not like, oh, this is just terrible, like, I don't like this, especially if you're comparing it to other things that are completely different, like D&D 5e, whatever the case. It is a different game, so it's going to feel different. So you have to do more as a play tester than just identify, oh, this doesn't feel right. But you have to be able to identify the problem and maybe potentially offer some potential solutions to that problem. I mean, that is super helpful.
Or at the very least, identify why it's clunky. So like you may not have a solution for it, but being able to identify like it's clunky and this is why it's clunky in my opinion. I don't have a solution for it, but this is how I'm feeling and this is what I feel, So
absolutely. But I think it's so easy, and I actually really appreciate this group of guys, because it would be so easy for the whole table to sit around and be like, oh yeah, that was good, that was fun, or it's just
I fall into that a little bit too much. I'm not gonna lie.
I don't know about that though. Like, one of the things that I think you and I, though, Dane, aside from some of the other guys, is with you kind of being a co-creator of everything, helping with the Fantasy Forge Studio side, is we sit down and we talk a lot. So you understand a lot more where things are coming from.
Sure, yeah.
Or maybe some of the other guys, like, they don't have quite the same going into it. So I think it's valuable being able to have you and understanding why it is. So maybe you might sit down and be like, okay, something doesn't feel right, but I understand why it is. Why it is the way that it is, and why this maybe element of combat exists. But you can also, coming from that place, be able to effectively critique about like maybe how things could be improved.
Exactly.
With that, where like maybe some of the other guys that don't have quite that inside information as much about the game could be like, this doesn't feel right. I don't know what it quite is, but I'll maybe get back to you on that. Or maybe they even sit back and think about it like, okay, it makes sense. Maybe I just didn't know my character enough. Like I don't know all of the actions of combat, and which comes to the other side of giving it some time.
Yes.
So, and that's part of the reason, like testing is honestly one of the longest, most drawn out parts of creating a game. Because if you as a creator are constantly changing things, unless like something is super blatant, like as an issue, but if you are constantly changing things every time you sit down, you are never going to finish.
It's true.
And so sometimes players just need some time to be able to play a couple combats, so like more than just 3 combats. Maybe they need to sit down and like, play over and over and over again and be able to optimize some of like the things about how they play their characters. Like maybe they're playing their character completely wrong, based off of, I don't know, like other characters that they play in maybe like other games that they have.
Well, I think the perfect example of that is the fact I play, obviously my main character is Yuki. She's a DPS. So she's a physical DPS. Like she plays way different than Dane, who's a support. Supports and DPS are like opposite sides of the map on how they're supposed to be played. And I was playing him like a DPS, at least at the beginning of it. And because I was playing him as a DPS at the beginning of it, I got myself into some issues early on in the battle, which put some of my other party members into some stressful situations. For example, Dane went right up into a bunch of slimes, and he got consumed by them. And so Belbin had to come over and save him. Not only partially that, but Luxalia had to stop what she was doing, and she had to run over there and get me healed because I was trapped inside one of these slimes. And so because I was playing my character not how I was intended to play, it made things more difficult for the party. At the same time, you could still do some things. So for example, later on in the encounter, I was using him more as like a tank character, like a Zill type character, because again, I was trying to protect Salik and that, but I was being a lot more careful, not nearly as reckless, but I still wasn't playing him to his most effective way that he could. Basically, I was just plugging a hole and letting Belbin finish everyone off, is basically what I was doing. So,
which, I mean, that is one way to effectively play if you don't have a tank character involved in your group. And again, it's kind of the strategy involved. And so, like, where, for example, it might be like, well, this combat system sucks because Dane just kept getting surrounded and trapped and he was dying way too quickly. Maybe it's less of this combat system sucks because my character's dying and more like you got to learn to play your character.
Exactly, yeah.
That's kind of that part of it. Honestly, one of the biggest, most drawn out things that creating the patronages and the paths for each character, and like the different kind of elements, whether they're an attacker or physical attacker, elemental attacker, defender, or supporter. Like they all play very differently and they all play complementary. If you're not playing them though in a way that's complementary to each other, especially at high levels of the game, it can be very difficult to be able to overcome seemingly overwhelming odds by just playing a straight attacker playstyle. And that's I'm not saying one of my greatest gripes about other tabletop RPGs is like, but this game is a lot more cooperative in the fact that you actually have to rely on the way that your character plays, as opposed to like, I make all my own decisions and my party makes all their own decisions, and every now and then like we'll come and like do some sweet combo or like support each other. It's like, if you're not doing that every time, and the characters are built that way so it's not difficult, if you're doing that every time, the combats are going to be challenging and they're going to be fun, but at the same time, chances are you'll be able to overcome if you play your characters well.
Exactly. Well, and I know one thing about this specific playstyle about Everlast compared to like something like D&D. I know I use D&D a lot. D&D is the big guy there. You're comparing to, right?
Well, and also what we're most familiar with. So.
Exactly. But one thing I think that's a huge comparison between the two of them is I feel like D&D, the especially the characters, it's like optimized characters, like self-optimized characters, and then there's not really a role that they fill. I mean, obviously they have specialties and what they're good at and stuff, but like you can kind of like, it's a bunch of individuals working together, if that makes sense. Whereas the thing that I really like about Everlast is each character is designed to fulfill a specific role. And that's actually the MMORPG and JRPG, I guess, comes a lot from that. So I know I talk about a little bit about it during my normal streams weekly and stuff about myself living in Japan and how I see this aspect of the game every day in my life. So Japanese society, you kind of have to understand, is a society where it's not individualistic to a certain extent, but it's what can you do to fill your role in society. So the common moniker is you don't have to do everything mediocre, but if you do one thing really well, you can help the rest of your, you can help everyone else. Everyone can
also rely on other people to do their jobs,
exactly,
about what their specialty is.
Exactly.
And you create a cohesive specialty team.
But that's partially why the JRPG battle system is how it is. That's partially why MMORPGs are designed why they are. There's a reason why they're so popular here in Japan, because not only are they really fun ways to like play games, like you have your role. I'm the healer. I can sit back here and support my party by giving out heals, do a little bit of damage here and there, but mainly do heals. I could be a DPS. I can go up and just deal a whole bunch of damage, whittle the boss's HP down or an enemy's HP down really quickly. I may not be as thick. I may not be as chunky. I may not have that much support to be able to do, but I'm meant to attack something. And then I could be the tank, where I could just literally take all the attention away from my party members so they can do their job effectively, and I can just take all the hits. Whereas that is a really popular genre here in Japan, and it's very real to people too, because again, that's what Japanese people are taught. They're taught to fulfill a role in society. And so like there's a reason why they're so big in Japan, like MMORPGs and that kind of stuff. But in reality, like you should be able to support each other, like in real life, you know. You should be
one of the Christian principles too that this game is really based off of are people are meant to be in community and people are meant to be together.
Yes.
You're not supposed to be a person just off on your own, being alone or doing things, because we were made, whether or not you're social, antisocial, whatever the case. Like for example, I can be social. I'm sociable, but I much prefer, I'm a more reserved.
Me too.
Yeah, much more reserved individual. However, that doesn't mean that I shouldn't surround myself with the people that, you know, bring me closer to God. And you all work together. Like for example, like one of the things that I really enjoy is I love teaching the faith. And I used to be a youth minister back before really working full time at this. I used to be a youth minister for the Catholic Church, and so I would teach kids. And so I really loved teaching, but like mission wasn't necessarily my thing. Where, for example, we'd go on retreats and we would have these speakers come out and basically, like, as far as like they really help to promote the mission, provide the opportunities for the kids to be able to go out. And so like I'm working with some of these speakers, I'm working with other charities and that kind of stuff to be able to provide these kids with a well-rounded experience to get to know and understand God, where maybe I'm not so good at maybe some of those extra more social types things, but I'm really good at the teaching aspects to help them to understand Christ.
Exactly. And so like you fit that one role in the society of the church that you're working at. And like I feel like that's one thing that's really important about Everlast as well. It's you're not an individual. You're trying to work together for a common goal, and that goal is to save Everlast, glorify the creation that Alumnia created. You know what I mean?
Correct.
And so like you're in it together. So yes, you're a mortal person. Unlike D&D where you can get just like super OP, that's not the case for Everlast. You could be better than some people at specific things, but you're working together to try to go for a specific goal. And I think this battle style, or just in general, battle style, we're talking a lot about it because that's like been the biggest critique we've had in our time doing this since we've been streaming. But that's a really big thought process behind how the battle system is laid out.
Your humanity becomes your strength.
Exactly.
Where like a lot of the creatures that you fight, yes, some of them do have like tactics to be able to work together, but a lot of the enemies that players will fight tend to be very individualistic and maybe one-track minded, and even if they work in big groups, and maybe if they're somewhat organized, like you still have like one big baddie that's like that's controlling everything. Where honestly, the players themselves, the heroes, are they're completely dependent on each other.
Exactly. And that's a strength too, because here's the thing: you can overcome a challenge that's more difficult if you can work together to do so, you know?
And the characters are designed to do that. Like, you will be more optimized, you will be more effective if you work together.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, stat block wise, we've probably been out manpowered 100 to 0 or 100 to 1 in some instances that we've been playing, but it's because of the teamwork you can overcome that, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we've noticed that definitely, for sure, like in that battle with oh my gosh, the butcher, what's his name? You know what I'm talking about. The
Grandul Bloodluster.
Yeah, Bloodluster, that guy. One of the mini bosses. We really missed a character like Luxalia there, especially Yuki, and we really missed like a support character because we had a tank and we had a DPS, and we really missed that. So yes, we may have been able to dispatch of them quite quickly, but we were also quite in a lot of danger. We weren't able to do nearly as much because we don't have all those rules filled that we needed to have filled. And that's humanity. Like, you're not going to be perfect at everything, and we overcame it, but it would have been so much easier if we had the rest of the party, you know? So
absolutely. But I mean, and the way that this dungeon is designed too is it's for a lower level. So actually, by splitting the party up as far as play testing, it made it actually easier for me to be able to balance on a realistic level of, all right, this is a dungeon meant for level 1, level 2 players, not meant for level 7 players. And so some of the play testing, actually, by splitting the party up, it was actually a lot more helpful to me as far as like, all right, like we can kind of break them down and average them out. Like if it was like a party of 5 or 6, like, yeah, sure. Like maybe it would be like level 3s as opposed to like level 7s. But yeah, it just made it a little bit easier on playtesting perspective as far as like, what did that combat feel challenging? How so? What elements could make it better? And like all of these things that happened during the testing and the play testing actually helped me not only to build the narrative of the story, but you know, like some of the encounters, like it gives me a better idea of how to, like with each combat that goes by, all right, how can I balance the enemies to make it to where it's going to be a fun challenge, and like it puts pressure, but it doesn't feel so hopeless where it's not fun anymore.
I mean, completely agree with that. And I think like as a creator, that's something you have to think about. And as a playtester, someone who's testing the game, I think that's incredibly important too, to be able to experience and have your own experience through it and really understand. It helps you understand the game a little bit better when you have those missing elements, you know? And it's just like, okay, wow, this is what the game's really based off of. We're supposed to be together. We're supposed to do this kind of thing. It's doable outside, but it's not D&D where you can just like go and just have superpowers and just punch everything into the earth, you know?
Yeah, one punch.
It's just one punch everything. I feel like sometimes with Yuki she can do that. But that's actually one of the changes that's happened. I know Yuki has been doing tons and tons of damage. There was one element just based off of us talking back and forth, and we're like, wow, she's really doing a lot of damage. So we actually changed one of the abilities and how it actually works. We haven't actually utilized it in stream yet, but hopefully it helps a little bit with like just the sheer amount of damage that she puts out, kind of thing. And so little things like that, just like even the good things and the positive things, the things that I really like, you kind of have to realize, okay, this is a little bit broken here. Like, how can we fix that? You know, or like,
absolutely,
yeah. So things like that. But I think we've talked.
And figuring out, well, and one last thing, I think one of the best things about the play testing is, as a creator, like being able to figure out, like with all of the stats the players have, they have 7 stats total that pretty much create a character. And being able to utilize, and with combat being such a central focus in the game, it's helped me. Like one of actually the biggest critiques is like, okay, how is this stat even useful in combat? Why would I ever dump any points into the stat? Because like if combat's so big in this game, like, and this isn't useful, so it's helped me to be like, what are some interesting ways I can utilize this specific statistic in combat? And it actually has helped to create, what was that?
I was gonna ask, like, are there any stats that you're surprised yourself that you've been able to include in combat that you initially, when you made the stat, you didn't even think would be involved at all?
Charisma.
Charisma.
Absolutely charisma.
Explain.
And the biggest reason for that is when I was actually originally creating this idea of like the 4 types of characters: the physical attacker, the elemental attacker, the well, there's no elemental attacker technically in any class anyways, but physical attacker, elemental attacker, the protector class, and then also the basically support class. One of the things that I found that was actually quite a problem was differentiating, other than just like stacking up their DV or like increasing their HP by a buttload compared to the rest of the party. How do I make the defender different? Because the way that it was originally made is it was a bad attacker, not a super good supporter. So it was definitely kind of like the left out character, the left out creature. And actually, when we were doing the D&D rules, the way that Zill played was just a straight out fighter.
He's a fighter, yeah.
He was a DPS. He was an intense DPS, and you might not see that he does quite as much damage as maybe he used to. But his role has completely changed since then. Because I know Zill, Max's character, wanted his character to be the defender, the tank type character. And one of the biggest stats that actually he utilizes now for that is charisma in the form of enmity. And so again, this is actually one of the small changes that were made actually after our last session, but changing like the enmity rules and like how that goes at the beginning of the game and just tying it into just the charisma score in general. And so being able to utilize enmity, and enmity is good for disengaging. And again, enmity, like maybe in the last battle that was on stream, didn't play a lot of roles, but a lot of the players weren't utilizing the enmity stuff.
It definitely could have. I know Thordane could have definitely benefited by disengaging and getting the heck out of dodge, but he just stayed in there. He was encountered into battle. He was challenged in an encounter, and he never used his enmity or his charisma stat to try to break away and get away from them. So yeah,
exactly. So essentially what that does is like with the enmity being their charisma stat is they can throw their bodies into an enemy, and as long as they're challenging, as long as they have the highest enmity in the combat, creatures are forced to attack them. And that's why it's important, again, with the positioning, being able to challenge as many creatures as possible as a defender type class, because what it does is it keeps eyes off of your party members. So what it did was it essentially turned him from, all right, I can only do 1 attack currently right now, and that's not a whole lot, but my job is to protect my party. So everyone eyes on me while the rest of the party does the damage. Again, there wasn't any defenders in the last combat session, and probably the tankiest character that was there was Belbin.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think the party did a great job of basically parceling out and dividing characters enough to be able to, again, as Dane mentioned before, Thordane plugging up gaps while Belbin did his job just clearing things out. And that was actually one of the criticisms at the end of last session from some of the play testing was enmity seems useless. And part of the backlash with that was not backlash, but my response to that is, one, nobody utilized anything that enmity was good for, because it's good for everyone. It's really good for everyone as far as disengaging, taunting, doing all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, there also wasn't a defender in your group. And so, yes, it might have seemed useless, but that's an essential thing that is part of a defender. And so you can't just remove that aspect of the battle because you didn't have a defender in your party. If anything, the fact you didn't have a defender and the fact you weren't utilizing enmity type skills made the combat much more difficult than it needed to be. And that's just idea of knowing your character.
And you just have to, especially you can rely on not using your enmity not quite as much. I know Yuki, she's got a really high charisma stat, so she would be obviously a high charisma stat. So if she challenged anyone, they would be attacking her, you know. And so like obviously she has to deal with it. But say a character like Thordane, he's never gonna have that. He's got a really low charisma stat. In fact, his stat dump is charisma, and so like he's gonna consistently have low charisma, which would be good since he's a ranged DPS, right? So, or ranged, not DPS, but a ranged support. Typically that doesn't matter too much, but say he does get sucked into battle, the fact that he has a low charisma stat's going to be not a benefit to him, because he's not going to be able to quite as easily break away from characters or enemies who are trying to like coax him in and stuff like that. He can't do that. So it's important to have that as a stat, you know, for
But
sure.
it's important for him to know, like, if there is a situation where maybe like he might struggle disengaging from something, just stay away from the combat altogether and do what he can from afar, which Thordane's really good at anyway. So, but again, like he did his job of plugging up the holes and in a way, making sure that the lever was being able to be pulled. So being able to change like your playstyle that way, but sometimes at the detriment of possibly almost dying.
Yeah. Which he did.
Again, it's a way to put pressure on players.
Yeah.
But I really want to focus before I move on to the playing aspect of this idea of knowing your character. I guess this is actually a really good transition of going into playing.
Yeah.
Is the idea of knowing your character and how to play your character, and why it's so important before the sessions to look over your character sheet and also look over what each of the actions.
This doesn't just go for Everlast. This goes for like D&D. This goes for all the tabletop RPGs, because I can't tell you, even when we were playing it as D&D, how often it would be like, I'm using this spell wrong, or I'm not utilizing my character to the fullest. So this is for every game, not just Everlast.
Well, I even think of, like, for example, watching like Critical Role. One of the things that Matt Mercer constantly mentions is like, it's not my job to know your character. So if they have a question about something, of course you have your rule book, you can go through and you can find out and figure it out, but it slows the gameplay down. And it, again, talking about clunkiness of combat, it adds to the clunkiness of combat because you don't know how to play your character, and it's not necessarily the Fate Weaver's job to know your character to a T. I mean, a really good Fate Weaver does, and I have the fortunate ability of creating these characters, but there's so many different types of patronages and paths and stuff that it gets mixed up for me, and it's very difficult to have everything at my fingertips without drastically slowing the game down. And so one of the like sole responsibilities for the player is to be able to look at their character and know them as best as they possibly can. To be able to speed things up in combat, to be able to actually effectively use strategies. Again, with this being a very cooperative based game, it's so important to know your characters, to be able to keep your party alive, to be able to stay alive yourself, to be able to effectively take down a creature, and to honestly challenge me. The ultimate point of the Fate Weaver, especially in combat, is my job is to take down the party. The party is playing against me. The party's playing against and it's, you know, sometimes if like I'm sitting there and nothing's going my way, I get frustrated as a Fate Weaver controlling enemies that nothing's working. Or, you know, I want a fun combat, and I don't also want to have to dumb down my stuff just because I'm like, oh, this low level encounter, there's no way it should kill them, and like they're just suffering. So I'm gonna maybe just like relax a little bit and put a little bit less pressure. That's not as fun for me as a Fate Weaver either. I want a challenging combat. I want something that at the end of the day, like we're both sides are just like, whew, glad that's over. Glad we overcame that. Like that was really fun. Like the pressure is what's fun.
I agree. I totally agree. And almost like the fact of like not knowing what to do in the moment too. Like, I mean, that's where knowing your character helps, right? Because then you have all these options at your fingertips to be able to interact. And that's why it could be frustrating, is if you don't know your character super well. I mean, I ran into it with Thordane, having to work with Thordane. If you don't know your character super well, it's just like, crap, what can I do in this situation to help my party or to save myself from dying? Or like, what can I do? And like, it adds to the fun of it, but like at the same time, it's like, if you know your character, it makes it a little bit easier, you know, to overcome.
Yeah, it does. Well, and the decisions become much clearer. It's like, all right, so in this situation, again, it comes down to strategy. How do you optimize? I know, for example, like Cole's very much a player, whether it comes to D&D, whether it comes to Everlast, where he wants to optimize his character as best as possible, make it as best as possible. Where it's much easier to optimize your character when you know what your character does and what role it fills. And so with Luxalia being a healer, maybe Luxalia's job isn't to sit there and just like pelt everything with spells from a distance. I mean, she has one use of that. But if she makes her way too far from the party and doesn't allow herself to be able to use healing arts and stuff on people to be able to keep them alive, the party can quickly become overwhelmed and be in lots of trouble. And so where she's best optimized isn't necessarily in her offense, but more of her healing and positioning capabilities.
And I completely agree with that. So Yeah, I mean, that was great talk about the testing. Hopefully we answered some of your guys' questions when it comes to that. But this is a game. So because it's a game, I think the most important part of the game is playing the game, right? For
Absolutely.
Pete's sake, it's a game. So I think we're both in agreement when we come with it. The most important part of the game, I would say, or not the most important part, I would say, but one thing that I think a lot of people struggle with when they're playing any game, I know I struggle with it when I stream, is switching from one playstyle to another. So like that transition.
Why don't you talk a little bit about that as far as like how you struggle with it on your stream?
Yeah. So I know, for example, one of the biggest challenges I've had, and one thing I used to do on this channel was when I would stream 3 games a week. And that often became incredibly difficult for me. Even if they were in the same genre. So for example, there was a time where I was streaming, what was I streaming? I was playing Breath of the Wild, I was playing Octopath Traveler, and I was playing Hollow Knight. So Hollow Knight's very different than those other two, but when it came to Octopath Traveler and Breath of the Wild, arguably 2 JRPGs, but very different playstyles. And oftentimes I would find myself getting really far behind in Octopath, and it wasn't optimal, wasn't that kind of thing. Another situation in which that took place was this past winter when Elden Ring came out. I was actually playing Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I'm now back to playing, but I actually had to stop playing Fire Emblem Three Houses because playing Elden Ring was screwing me up so much I wasn't getting anywhere because it was such a big jump from 2 different games and 2 different play styles. And I know that's one thing when it comes to a genre, when you're trying to stay within the genre. Like if I was playing 2 games, for example, Octopath Traveler or like Golden Sun, for example, similar kind of games. It's an easier type of transition from both of those. Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring, yes, very different in theme, but the same kind of game, and it's an easier transition to both of those. So tabletop RPGs in general should be the same way, I feel. So like there should be like kind of that smooth transition from like a D&D style game or a Pathfinder type game to a game like Everlast, right?
But that being said, one of the things that is very different is because it very heavily draws from elements of other types of games too.
That's
so
true.
Yes, while Everlast is still technically solidly in the tabletop RPG genre, I would look at it as like the spectrum where you have like D&D, Pathfinder, all that kind of stuff, like very hardcore role playing. And then I would say on the complete opposite spectrum, let's just say like war game. War game is very different.
Yeah.
Where like Everlast flirts with the borderline between almost being a war game but still having the like role play, like tabletop RPG elements of it. Does that make sense?
It does.
And so like it is a difference by going from like D&D Pathfinder to a game like Everlast. And so being able to know, if you're playing 2 different styles, it could be difficult to be able to transition between the 2 until you master it.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they're still very much within the same genre.
Yeah, I mean, now that I think about it, like if I went back, so I feel like I've mastered Fire Emblem at this point. I feel like I could play Fire Emblem now and go back to playing something like Elden Ring and be completely fine. But at least when I was learning the games and learning how to play them, it was incredibly difficult. So yeah, spending that time to actually learn the game is incredibly important, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's a process, right? Giving yourself the time to be able to learn to play the game. And this isn't about the testing part of it. This is just talking about learning to play new games. So when this game actually does come out to the market for you guys, yeah, it might feel a little bit different. It might feel a little bit slower than say like...
Especially if you are used to playing something like 5e or used to playing something like Pathfinder. Like the fact that this is so cooperative, so co-op focused, and the strategies, honestly, are completely different. Completely different. You might pick up Everlast and be like, oh, this doesn't feel right. But the more you play it, you never know. You might actually come to like the play style a little bit more.
Not gonna lie,
And it makes it actually more accessible. Like this play style makes it more accessible for people who maybe are coming from an RPG, just like a JRPG background.
Might make a lot more sense.
Wargaming. Yeah, it might like frustrate them less making that transition. And so it's one of those things that, and I mean, I'm always the one who, whenever I try a new thing, I always keep an open mind. And it's always just like, for me, I know my personality is like, I want to try to master something as soon as possible to make my life easy. And so if like, for example, coming over from D&D 5e and I was like picking up something like Everlast, like, all right, I'm going to focus all my attention. I'm going to know these rule books from front to cover. And, you know, once you master it, it'll make the transition from both of them easier. You can mentally make that separation of like, all right, these are the rules of this, or these are the rules of this. Where sometimes that can be really difficult. It's like there are different rule sets within Pathfinder and D&D, but the games are so similar that, you know, sometimes they begin to merge and like some of the rules become actually more homebrew than anything. It's more of like homebrew rules, house rules, and that kind of stuff kind of begin to trump the actual normal rules.
Yeah, I mean, I just think ultimately, like if you know what you're making and you know what you're playing, then that's obviously going to make it a lot easier for you to get into it. So that's the one thing I really appreciate about Everlast, is it knows what kind of game it is. Yes, it borrows a lot of elements from a bunch of other like categories and genres, but that should make it easier for people coming in. Like there's a starting point for everyone. It's not going to be something completely brand new that you're starting from. But at the same time, it is a tabletop RPG. There's a heavy role play like aspects to it. There's a heavy emphasis on the story and the narrative of the game, you know? So.
Well, and here's the thing. I think when it comes down to it, as a creator, you have to know what you're making.
Yeah, for sure.
Like one of the things as far as marketing the game or whatever the case is, again, this is basically a podcast about creating a game and everything. So I'll let you in on a little bit of a secret. One of the things that I'm currently in the process of doing, as we finish this game up, as you know, this game becomes, you know, available on the market and that kind of stuff, is I have to have this idea in my brain of who am I selling this to and what is this game?
Exactly.
What is this game and who am I selling it to? So you got to create this general profile of a person. You have to get even super detailed about like what are their like political leanings, whatever the case, like what are their religious leanings, whatever the case, or like is this like a boy or is this going to be good for primarily boys, girls, whatever the case. You got to know what you're making and how you're going to sell it to someone. And so I think that's one of the biggest things too, is realizing that like I'm not making this game for the D&D player primarily. I'm making this like, I'm not making this for like a hardcore D&D player or hardcore Pathfinder. I'm making this for someone who dabbles in a little bit of everything. And I feel like that's a more like common type person to find, where it's like, I love playing this war game. I love JRPGs. I really love role playing too. And I wish there was something that was unique that I could play. And that's the target person that I'm looking for to be able to play this game. Obviously, people that maybe want to try it and, you know, introduce themselves to something different. But if like, I'm like trying to, you know, like advertise this to someone who is like a hardcore, I play all of the tournaments for Games Workshop and like Warhammer and like Middle-earth strategy battle game, whatever the case, it might not initially come off as something that it's like, you know, I'm just good with like my own wargaming stuff. Like this is more for someone that's like, I like to play that on the side, but I also like to play my D&D campaigns, but at the same time I really like video games. And so like, you know, this adds elements of all that. So that like kind of like middle person is who this game is aimed towards.
Yeah.
Again, not saying that you can't have an audience of all of those like other people, like super serious D&D gamers, but they have to come to the game realizing that it is something different than those.
Exactly. And I also do feel like in general, especially for someone, I would say I'm a very casual gamer. I'm not intense by any means or anything, but it's a easy transition into the tabletop RPG genre. I think oftentimes people are so when they want to play D&D or they want to get into like a game like Pathfinder, I think it's such a hard transition, kind of like what you're talking about. It's such a hard transition, especially coming from someone who's just very casual. Where I think it scares a lot of people away because it's just like, oh god, I have to find all these people to play with, not only, but like I'm gonna have to relearn all these rules and stuff. Whereas if you have a game that like has elements of a genre that you're used to, then it makes it easier. At the very least, like there's a foothold into the door, right? It's not completely closed and it doesn't seem impossible for you to get into. So I agree. And like you were saying, I actually personally like this better than D&D. Yes, D&D might be quicker and more like streamlined in a sense, but this is a game made, like you're mentioning, this is a game made for someone like me. And this is a game made for someone who is that casual gamer who likes a bunch of different genres. So I completely agree with
it
that.
becomes streamlined though, like once you learn the game and once you learn the rules.
Mhm.
Like the combat is like, again, we're focusing a lot on the combat, but the combat goes by quick
Mhm.
when everybody knows what they're doing. And I mean, I know like even in D&D, a lot of people have house rules where you only have 15 seconds to make a decision in order to keep the game pace going. Where in this one, like, yeah, some people might, homebrew rules where it's like you have 15 seconds, but what that does is it forces players to know their characters.
Yeah. Very true.
And know what they do.
Yeah.
And it's quintessentially to a game of communication as well, which is one thing that's near and dear to my heart and that I love. Like that stems from my years back of like growing up with like the N64 and inviting all of your friends over to be able to play Mario Kart, Super Smash Brothers, all that kind of stuff, and not necessarily all online doing that kind of stuff. But it's like those four people that you can get together, including yourself, that you can like go and like play these with, like super nostalgic, and it's so much fun. And it's one of those things where it's like you can be competitive against each other, but it's like it created so much joy being able to do that. And so the way that this is kind of set up is almost kind of like that, as opposed to where it's like, actually I think this is a really good way to explain it, where D&D is like really great. It's like the online gamer where it's just like, all right, I'm trying to find all the people in my online community to form the group, but it's like primarily
so I can play
like
my character. So I can play
Right.
my character that I created, kind of thing.
Where like Everlast would be something where it's just like, oh, I'm inviting the guys over or the friends over for, like a sleepover to play a 4-player Mario Party game.
Let's
We're
make
gonna
a
work
cohesive
together.
party together, kind of thing.
Yeah. Or like one of the games that I think of, like one of the old arcade games, is like Gauntlet. Dark Legends.
Oh yeah.
Like that was a quintessential like game, like 4-player game where like you are making your way through everything, and they got so much fun. And again, nostalgia comes out of that, which is some of the inspiration for this as well.
And I mean,
So,
speaking
know
of
what you're
games,
making.
I mean, and speaking of those games like Gauntlet, like Mario Party, like that kind of stuff. What was the purpose of getting all the guys together? What was or gals, if you're a girl as well? But what's the purpose of getting your group of friends together? Ultimately, the purpose is to get together, relax, and have fun. Have fun is the most important part of when it comes to a game. And again, you have to approach it that way. You have to approach it like this is a game. Like this isn't like something super serious. Yes, the themes and the topics might be serious within it, but it's a game and it's meant for you to play to have fun.
And again, it goes back to the whole idea of creation, of like the creation of this game as a whole. This game isn't meant to be a duplicate of something that already exists. It's meant to be a unique experience that's fun to play cooperatively with your friends.
Exactly.
I mean, that's something, it's funny. It's like, that's not something that's necessarily new to the table, but I feel like in the genre, it kind of is. I mean, I know, again, you have things like Gloomhaven that kind of have more of that, like, get together with your friends, team building aspect and that kind of stuff. But, like, this one is quintessentially supposed to be a cooperative game in nature. And at the end of the day, like, as long as you're getting together with your friends and having fun playing it in this world of Everlast, this world that, actually forces you to have like some grip with reality while still being able to have some escapism. The goal is to have fun. Yes, maybe in the process you become a better person by playing it. I think that's definitely a key idea of Everlast, is to help us to be better people, good people. But as long as you're having fun, like, that's an amazing thing. And like, that's what makes me happy. That's what keeps me going on this. Yes, I'm in love with this world, and it's a world that I want to show you, and a world that I want you to have fun playing. Ultimately.
Yeah. And I will say personally on my end, and I know the rest of the guys can vouch as well, we're having an absolute blast playing it. I know there are those bumps in the road, and we'll continuously have them, but when all is said and done, it's a group of guys who are on complete opposite sides of the world. It's a good excuse for us to get together, hang out, have that bi-monthly camaraderie that I know I so miss, especially being alone over here in the rural countryside of Japan. I don't have that community, so this is one of those aspects. Streaming as well as Everlast are my avenues for being able to enjoy that community, and I am loving it with every fiber of my being.
Well,
And
it brings me back to years ago when I had my bachelor's party. Like the fact that this game stemmed from a homebrew D&D, bachelor's party with the closest guys in my life. It's one of those things that this game was birthed out of a lot of really good people in my life and people that I enjoy spending time with. And what better people in my life do I get to share this experience of creating this game with than both Jonathan, Connor, Dane, Max, Cole, and even my brother-in-law Keegan as well, who's not a part of the campaign. But just all these guys being able to enjoy something that's so beautiful, something that's so fun. And ultimately, yeah, like you said, Dane, be able to grow closer and have an excuse to be able to just see everybody in this crazy world, especially with this distance between all of us. It's that time where we can be brought back to, our Nintendo 64 days, GameCube days of like being together and like just making time for each other and spending time and having fun and playing. It's been such a blessing. And like my friendships, like with all these guys, have blossomed into something even more beautiful, and it's continued to grow with Everlast as the catalyst. Like if anything comes out of this, like I'm at least grateful to Everlast for that. It's allowed me to build lasting friendships, to just be able to have fun, but be able to be real with each other and to learn along the way and to make good decisions. And I feel so much closer to all of them because of Everlast.
Well, one thing that's, I know I'm at least hoping when we do eventually make this game public to the public, is that it can also be that catalyst for other groups of friends or for other people as well, to bring them closer together and to have them feel that brotherhood of man, And it's so important. It's so lacking in this world. Again, everyone's just so far apart and so spread apart. So again, I really believe in Everlast. I know those of you who are watching also do believe in it for sure. We're really excited for the future of it. But yeah, I guess this podcast was just us wanting to really just talk about the behind the scenes of Everlast, because you guys see like the pretty picture that we put out there. It may not be all that pretty sometimes, but at the same time, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, a lot of thought that goes into it. It's not just like a bi-monthly thing that we just put out there. This is the series. I know for myself personally, but obviously for you as well, Kyle, but all of the other guys too. It's one of the things that we make a priority in our lives, and we work so hard to make it in a wonderful game for you guys to be able not only to experience on stream, but when we eventually do put it out to a market, millions of people can enjoy, billions of people. Let's be optimistic. Billions of people can enjoy.
That's the goal. The goal is for this game to be in the hands of every single man, woman, and child in the entire world. Yeah. Let's work towards that goal together.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. I think so we're going to end it for today. So thanks again, Kyle, for stopping by and obviously telling us all about your woes, your victories of creating this game and just game creation in general. I know it's something that's been very interesting to me, and hopefully it's interesting to the rest of you guys. So any last comments, Kyle, before we head out?
Thank you all, as always. Continue to support the Fantasy Forged Studios Twitch page, YouTube, all that kind of fun stuff. We're on this journey together with you, and we are so grateful to you, and you're the reason that these dreams are going to become a reality. So thank you always, and may God bless each and every one of you.
Bye, guys.